Good morning to those of you on the West Coast. Good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast, and good evening for those of you joining us from the US. Thanks for joining us for the ACCU webinar. My name is Ryan Smyth. I'm the Managing Director of Stratium Group, and I'm really privileged today to be joined and to be able to facilitate this panel with Calvin Fine of VECKTA and Liz Aitken of Empire Carbon and Energy. I'll give a very brief introduction to the two panelists. We've got some very deep domain experience, very valuable to share that with us. And then we'll launch into some panel questions, hopefully before receiving some questions from the audience towards the end. I believe there's a comments section in the LinkedIn live stream where you can post your questions and we'll try and get through them. For those of you that don't get your question answered, we will endeavour to get back to you over the next 48 hours bearing Easter break to respond to your question. So we'll start with Liz. Liz is an accomplished energy sector professional with deep experience in energy and carbon trading. She's passionate about helping SMEs face the challenges of the new carbon economy whilst growing their business. She has spent many years in a variety of roles and has a very deep understanding of operational, strategic risk and regulatory issues with respect to energy and carbon market participation, and in particular, the effect of short and long-term market cycles on business opportunities. She also has a particular interest in microgrids and their evolution here in Western Australia.
Thank you.
Calvin has been helping commercial and industrial businesses to get the best out of their suppliers for close to 20 years. He gets excited about great businesses collaborating to deliver great projects while delivering profitable outcomes for customers, suppliers, investors, and employers. He's had a raft of experience with senior supply chain and commercial roles across Unilever, MMG, Foster's Group, and he's very recently shifted his focus to accelerating the energy transition, helping businesses, and I'm sure many of you relate to this, be more resilient, greener, and cut their energy bills. He's a qualified engineer, an economist, and has an MBA from Melbourne Business School. And without further ado, I'll just maybe get the first question off to you, Liz. This is a pretty opaque subject for most, and I've had some people reach out to me in advance. What is an ACCU, and how is it different from a carbon credit or a REC or these other terminologies that we hear around the market today?
Sure. Look, I do know it can be very confusing, and I think the carbon industry and the energy industry are on par for the sheer volume of acronyms that we managed to create. So look, an ACCU stands for an Australian Carbon Credit Unit. Now, so it is a carbon credit unit. What is the thing that makes it different from other units is that it's a unit that's issued by the Australian federal government under Australian legislation. So some of you may hear things like voluntary credits. You might have heard VERA, Gold Standard. They're all international bodies that have accreditation sort of frameworks, and you can have voluntary credits, sort of created under those agencies. This is the Australian federal government version of a carbon credit unit. Now, a carbon credit unit specifically is it's basically, it gives you a credit. So 1 unit is equal to 1 tonne of carbon that's been abated or avoided. So it could be taken out of the atmosphere and sequestered somehow, or in some instances it is also around displacing one form of, the majority of the people in the room are energy related. So imagine that you displace diesel with solar power. So you're actually not abating something. So it's a combination of avoided as well as sequestered carbon. That's how you earn a credit. Now, carbon credits are different from what we call RECs, which are the renewable energy certificates, of which there are 2 types. One is an LGC, which is a large-scale generation certificate, and the other is an STC, which is a small-scale traded credit. Now, what those two are is basically it's recognising the fact that you are actually generating from a registered renewable source, okay, and you get 1 credit for every megawatt hour of energy that is produced. Now, under the STC system, which is actually the system that most people in their day-to-day lives come across, because it's also called the solar rebate. So, if you go and buy a solar system for your house, there's quite often this talk about, government rebate will give you, $3,000 off the total cost. That's actually an accumulated and formula-based or formula-driven calculation of how many credits, how many megawatt hours of energy the system on your roof would actually make over the life to 2030 of the asset. Right. With large-scale certificates, which is what is the majority of certificates in the whole system, they are produced as you go for every megawatt hour of renewable energy that's created. So does that help you understand some of the differences between RECs and LGCs and ACCUs and carbon credits?
Absolutely. Thanks, Liz. And I think we're really just touching the surface there. I suspect we'll circle back to that in a bit more detail later. It's a good way to set the scene. And Calvin, maybe I'll just jump to you. Liz talked a little bit about ACCUs, carbon credits and RECs, and I suppose how they're linked in a practical sense to energy. And I think that's probably the lens that most of the audience comes at this through. How do energy users go about delivering on-site energy at the moment, and what are some of the challenges you're seeing as someone that's being intimately involved in the market on a day-to-day basis in this space?
Yeah, sure thing. I'll keep this pretty high level. I'm sure we'll get into the weeds as the conversation unfolds. But in a practical sense, there's really 4 steps that businesses need to get through to start enjoying the benefits of on-site energy. It starts with prioritization. Typical businesses are running multiple operations. Each has different circumstances, different opportunities. And that's a balance of, large industrial sites, heavy lift energy solutions, and the long tail of the many smaller loads that still need to be served. So working out where to focus your energy first and foremost. From there, each opportunity needs to go through business case definition, really trying to understand whether there's value in pursuing on-site energy at all. Is it going to help you enough to accomplish your goals that it's worth the investment of your time, effort, and money? From there, you're going to have to collaborate with suppliers, and typically it's multiple suppliers. We'll get into the why and whatnot of that later on. And then the last stage, and this is really where you get to enjoy the benefits of both, generating RECs or ACCUs, as well as lower costs, improved resilience, and all of the other benefits that come from deploying on-site energy. That's where you deliver the system, you operate it, and you monitor performance to make sure that you are really getting what you paid for. So to summarize, 4 major steps are prioritization, defining a business case, collaborating with suppliers, and then delivering, operating, monitoring the system.
Awesome. Thanks, Calvin. So Liz, Calvin's given us a bit of an overview there of the process, which I know you're actually familiar with, of delivering on-site energy. It seems like for many larger projects, this will be a long process and arguably protracted. I'm very curious to understand, when a project starts to qualify for an ACCU. What's that point, and what does that look like? And is there something that customers or the audience need to do to be able to I suppose benefit from that ACCU?
Yes, absolutely. So look, and this does sort of touch on, I know, what is going to be in our next question, but and can I also just point out that this is not financial advice. Every client has different requirements. Thank you very much. The required disclaimer. Thank you. So look, the challenge here is that a decision around, there is an ability, and that's a result of recently changed legislation, but there is an ability for certain installations to actually earn ACCUs instead of earning LGCs. And we'll get into some of the details around how that works shortly. But what you've got to bear in mind is that making a decision about whether or not you want to earn ACCUs or earn LGCs actually needs to be made up front, and a fairly simple assessment can be undertaken that looks at the cost-benefit analysis of either earning LGCs or earning ACCUs. This is for installs. This is specifically around C&I-based portfolios, so or C&I businesses, because you're going to be installing more than 100 kilowatts of solar, and that's all wind. But that's the threshold number at which we you have the ability to start to make an optimizing decision for your own portfolio about what you prefer to use. You need to do this before you reach some form of financial investment decision. This is a specific step that the Clean Energy Regulator requires. So application for project status with the Clean Energy Regulator needs to be done before you've completed financial investment decision closure.
Okay, excellent. And I think one of the reasons we've had so much interest in this webinar across a number of sectors is, we understand that the legislation here has changed and changed very recently. I'd be curious to understand that a little bit more. What does that mean for our audience, and in particular, the time-sensitive nature of ACCU generation? And specifically, I'm talking about the legislation that was brought in, I believe, towards the middle to end of January this year.
Yeah, so, and when you add to that the additional legislation changes that actually occurred last week. Okay. So I know that we've got a slide. Ryan, if you could flick to that. There we are. Now, it's a fairly dense slide, as many legislative type slides tend to be. But the things to note are that, in particular, there was a change in January to what's called, it's commonly known as the ISO methodology for the Clean Energy Regulator to create, or to allow people to create carbon credit units, ACCUs. Right. So if you have, if you're installing behind the meter energy, you've got an opportunity to consider whether or not you want to earn ACCUs versus earning LGCs. Now, this is of particular interest and use for a number of different reasons. The first one is for any of those customers who are currently in the safeguard mechanism, and I'm not sure if there are any on this call, but just in case they are, one of the things to give consideration to is earning ACCUs off your Scope 2 emissions, which is basically energy use. By displacing that energy use with behind-the-meter renewable energy up to 30 megawatts, you can create ACCUs, which you can then use to retire against your Scope 1 liability with the under the safeguard mechanism legislation that got passed last week. So that's of particular interest. For other non-safeguard mechanism liable entities, what you've actually got an opportunity to do here is to safeguard yourself against some future and potential changes if you're an exporting company. So if you're exporting to Japan or Europe, potentially the US, we're not quite sure where that legislative change is at the moment, but it has been discussed. There are future carbon tax importing requirements that are coming through, and having ACCUs absolutely will mitigate any risk that you may have of those not being accepted by those entities that will be policing these particular outcomes. So it is a very, well, in a regulatory sense, it's a fast-changing landscape. I mean, regulation's not exactly known for the speediness of its of its pace of change. But relatively speaking, it feels like there's been a lot of legislative changes coming down the pipe. Admittedly, a lot of them have been in the works for a very long time, and they're all hitting in one quarter almost. So Q1 of 2023 has been a fairly significant period for regulatory change in this space. But it is actually going to continue as the needs of the climate, the needs of, I don't want to sound preachy, but the needs of the earth, really, our broader needs to reduce carbon emissions. As that increases, there are going to be more and more changes to legislative requirements going forward. The more things that you can do now, right, when it is still relatively easy to undertake some of these changes, particularly while supply chain is not too bad. Although, Calvin, I'm sure you can give us some more information about some of those issues, but supply chain delays are such that we want to be thinking about undertaking some of these projects and activities as quickly as possible. Did that answer your question, Ryan? I feel like I rolled around that a little bit.
Listen, I think it did, and I think we're all aware this is it's a paradigm shift in our market. It is fast moving and opaque, and that's why we have experts like yourselves, Liz, to hopefully shine a bit of light on what is a very challenging landscape for a lot of customers to navigate. I do like your segue, and Calvin, I'll bounce to you now. And everybody's talking about energy.
Before you jump to the next question, Liz, can I ask you a follow-on question to where you got to there?
Calvin.
So it sounds to me like if you were contemplating investing in behind-the-meter energy systems, the legislative shifts here have probably opened up some strategic flexibility for those prospective investments that didn't exist before. Really, what I'm curious about, would you say that if you had a project, a behind-the-meter energy project that was on the shelf and you were contemplating an investment, how have these changes impacted how you should be thinking about it as a principle? Has the market gotten better? Has it gotten worse? Has it stayed about the same?
Okay, so let's talk generally about the ACCU market then versus the LGC market. So look, if you had been considering undertaking a behind-the-meter install at your premises, one of the things that you would have given consideration to was the revenue stream that LGCs might have been able to provide to your project to help offset or improve your levelized cost of energy over the project's life. Now, the challenge with the LGC market as it stands right now is it is a falling forward curve, and the scheme finishes in 2030. Okay, so if you were to get everything done and built by the end of this year, okay, then you'd actually have 7 years worth of LGC earning capability. Okay, but you've got a declining forward curve, and a large part of that has got to do with the fact that the hard cap and this is all quite technical, but the hard cap in the legislation has actually been reached, and we've got a fairly stable enforced demand percentage for the required buyers. So retailers have to buy LGCs. Okay, and it's a mandated requirement for them. And that percentage has remained stable at about 18.9% for the last few years now, and will probably continue to remain that way until the end of 2030, when you've got more projects coming in that will be eligible to create LGCs. Now, this change in legislation, right, caps off the amount of megawatts that you can install behind the meter and earn ACCUs at 30 megawatts. Okay, so my recommendation is that projects that are anything from 100 to 150 kilowatts at the bottom end up to 29.9 megawatts at the top end, consider pushing themselves into this particular market segment or into the ACCU market, because they're not going to be crowded out by all of the big generators where their only market for green products is the LGC market. It's a niche opportunity that really does exist for C&I businesses. Now, the forward curve on ACCUs, obviously, we've seen more movement in that forward curve in the last 2 weeks than we have in quite some time. And you would realise, or you would both understand, that is because, obviously, the Greens announced that they were going to come to a deal with the Labor Party. And so then that, subject to the specifics of that, we've actually seen quite a lot of movement in the market. The market on Monday, following Friday's passing of the legislation for the safeguard mechanism, actually shifted upwards by a couple of dollars. Now, the good part about the shift in price and the specific changes in the safeguard mechanism legislation are such that this is now, if you can build this if you can build something by the end of 2023 and have it start generating, you are actually matching LGCs in terms of the time window that you can earn, because ACCU projects of this type have a 7-year window. Okay, so you can only earn credits for 7 years. So we've got equal parity, but based on, if you're doing diesel displacement, based on that at the moment, you would earn more from ACCUs over that 7-year window than you would from the LGCs that you would otherwise be eligible to earn. Okay. Now, obviously, the longer the delays to start from the time that you register the project, and you've got up to 3 years from registering an ACCU project under this methodology to the time that you're allowed to start. The longer that goes on, the better that opportunity becomes in creating ACCUs, because there's a hard stop on LGCs at the end of 2030. But with the ACCU projects, there's no stop other than a 7-year time frame in which to earn the ACCUs. Did that answer your question, Calvin?
Got it. Let me play it back to you and see if it did.
Oh, God. Okay. Yep.
It sounds like, depending on the circumstances, ACCU's niche opportunity and likely to be strategically better now. And the advantage of selecting ACCUs for behind the meter C&I is only going to grow over time because of that capped 2030 timeline on LGCs, which ACCUs are not subject to. So exciting prospect that's only going to become more attractive over time.
Yes, with a bigger demand pool of potential buyers of your certificates as well. So you're creating something into a rising market, which is always a plus. So and strategically you can use it for a couple of different things. You could sell on the credits if that's what if you want to do, or alternatively, if your boards have given direction as to reductions in greenhouse gases. There is also some interesting arbitrage opportunities between making ACCUs, selling them on, buying LGCs to fill up the difference. I mean, there's a whole bunch of different things that you can do by creating ACCUs in this particular window over the next 7 years, really.
Love it. Thanks for the deep dive, Ryan. I hope we haven't driven too far off of your agenda.
Well, no, and I hope everybody hasn't fallen asleep in the process, because it was a lot of stuff in a very short space of time there.
No, it's great, and Liz, you're already heading off some of the questions that we're starting to see through the thread anyway. So we'll go with the flow. But One thing I did hear, Liz, with which we often hear in these circumstances, is big advantage for first movers, and that sounds like it couldn't be more true in this scenario. Calvin, Liz alluded to supply chain there. I think, I don't think I know everyone is talking about the energy transition and on-site energy. What role does on-site energy have here, and what are some of the unique challenges? Liz talked about aggressive timeframes, 2023. If customers are looking to get projects up quickly, what are some of the things that they should be aware of, perhaps in the supply chain or perhaps the way the market's delivering these projects at the moment?
Yeah, right. Actually, I think the biggest challenge that energy users face here is about execution at scale. You can dive into any one project and probably work your way through it. Most C&I businesses are looking at relatively large portfolios of either sites or loads. When we see folk in the resources industry who have typically a smaller number of high intensity energy loads, they'll find that around a particular site there are 5 or 6 different distinct electrical loads to be served. So almost everybody has some kind of long tail. If you've got 20 sites in a portfolio and you can only execute on, say, 1 a year, the reality of it is you're not going to make it through that portfolio before the window of opportunity here is long closed. And actually, you'll still be working on the tail end of that portfolio at the time that it's time to decommission the first projects that you start building if you're starting today. It's something that we spend a fair bit of time helping large corporates to work through how to execute well. I'll give you a recent example of a defense contractor where just by being able to uplift their pace of execution on good opportunities that they know that they have, created something like a 5x, 4.5 to 5x increase in value delivery to that business over 10 years. Just because they can get to more opportunities more quickly. That's the primary thing. I'll touch on supply chain as well, Ryan, quickly, because you asked about it. Yes, the electrical infrastructure supply chains around the world at the moment are very stretched. To the point where there are people who've been collecting old decommissioned transformers and storing them on a farm somewhere, and they're busy refurbishing fields full of old equipment and making absolute fortunes just because they happen to have equipment that they can sell into projects now rather than having to wait 60 or 70 weeks for manufacturing lead times. We actually don't see that as the biggest barrier to action. By the time you work through prioritization and you work through business cases and then you work through all of the design and permitting and approvals that you need to, you just build those long lead times into your delivery schedule. They're frustrating and they cost you some time. For sure, it's not easy out there. But the bigger challenge is convincing your business to invest and investing your time, effort, and energy in the right sites and the right projects, more so than it is chasing bits of electrical hardware.
Thanks, Calvin. It's an interesting space. At the one end, you've got, as you alluded to, Calvin, people in the agricultural space stockpiling, old equipment, and then you've got some of the most progressive legislation with respect to a financial instrument that certainly we've seen in a long time as well. And maybe, Liz, just on that latter point, we hear a lot of commentary about people retiring ACCUs, trading ACCUs, forwards, futures. Could you give us a sense of what that all means?
Yeah, sure. So, look, many people in the audience will be aware of requirements associated with trading derivatives. So an ACCU is actually considered to be a derivative once it has been essentially created by the Clean Energy Regulator. So what that means is that all of the things that you can do with, let's say, a forward purchase on or a hedging position on foreign currency, you can also do all of those things with ACCUs. So it's got the ability to become a very sophisticated market. It's not there yet. We need some volume. And in particular, I think once we start to see the big guys, the larger emitters, the 215 emitters who now have got a liability that they have to meet every year, let's call it 5% year-on-year reduction requirement. Once they've fully wrapped their heads around what they need to do in terms of trading and hedging, then all of a sudden we're going to start seeing some depth appear in the market. But what you've got to bear in mind is that, like any financial instrument, which is what this is, because it's not like you can actually run out and say, oh, look, here's my ton of carbon that doesn't actually exist because I didn't emit it into the atmosphere. Okay, it's not a physical product per se, it is a financial instrument. So, it comes with all of the same complicated things that go along with, for example, an FX trade. That's probably the most comparable example. For those people who've been involved in the energy industry, particularly on the East Coast, it's very similar to having to trade in electricity on the East Coast. So we're going to see all of the same financial instruments coming to play. So that's where you get all of the talk about forwards and, there's even options. I did see yesterday there was one option trade, which is a first. So it's an option on a future buy of ACCUs. So I think that's the first time we've had an option written in the market, which is, well, for nerds like me, it's exciting. For lots of other people, they'll be like, oh, who cares? But it is a fantastic development. The issue of surrender, however, is something that is quite particular to the carbon market. So surrender is where you, at the end of each year, okay, if you want to say that you have offset X amount of carbon, utilizing carbon certificates, right? What that means is that you have to take those certificates that you have purchased from other people, and you, through a particular registry, you give them to the Clean Energy Regulator, and you say, these certificates here that I'm giving to you are the ones that I am asking you to extinguish. So I'm surrendering them to you to have them scrapped, right? In recognition that that is now offsetting directly against the liability that I may otherwise have. Okay, so it's that actual process that you undertake to say, this is it's the mechanics of, this is how I actually extinguish some of my liability for a year against these credits that I bought to offset them. So that's what surrendering or retirement means, but it's mostly referred to as surrender, but the terms are interchangeable.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thanks, Liz. We've just had a question there from the audience. I think we go straight back to you, Liz. You mentioned I think it was 100 or 200 kilowatt up to 30 megawatts range. Can you aggregate projects to fall into that band as part of a portfolio?
Yes, it will be possible to do that. It's not necessarily easy, but yes, we do want to see aggregation. There are certain ways that you can do it in the same way that so there are some types of renewable energy projects, some types of carbon projects where you've got little disparate bits of land, okay, and you want to plant trees on it. You can actually undertake a process called aggregation with the Clean Energy Regulator. We can do that with this particular methodology as well. There does have to be some agreements in place about how that actually works between the parties, but it's absolutely feasible. When you start getting into that level, though, you've just got to bear in mind there are going to be administrative costs to to doing that may outweigh if you don't get to a large enough level. So it's just one of those sorts of considerations that certainly I'm putting in place at the moment. You know, it can be done is the answer.
Okay, excellent. And Calvin, no, I'm just picking these questions out at random. Question for you. I have a number of sites in different states and different jurisdictions. How do I prioritize these sites with respect to on-site energy and understand, maybe the second part for you, Liz, I will start with you, Calvin, and understand what ACCUs, I could potentially generate from them. I'll start with you, Calvin, on the prioritization.
Yeah, sure. So to kick that off, you really need to know a little bit about the site itself. Some of that's about renewable resources. How much does the sun shine and how much does the wind blow? How much space do you have available? And can you get these things permitted at all? If you get through that, typically you're looking for places where you have relatively large loads and where you have relatively high energy costs. Typically electrical costs, can be natural gas costs as well, depending on the kind of project that you're contemplating. And some pieces around the infrastructure at your site. One of the big things for people in the industrial space is whether you've got sufficient safe load-bearing capacity on your roof to install solar. If roofs are getting to the ends of their useful lives, you'll often see sites further down the priority list. There are a range of other things that we would tend to look at as well to help you to get to the top of the list. But typically what you're aiming for is to identify a handful of strong candidates that you then pursue into understanding what the business case really looks like. At that point, you're diving into things like your actual load profile and how that might fit with different types of generation that you can accommodate at the site. What you're looking to do is build a business case at a sufficient level of confidence. This is not detailed engineering. We haven't specified every piece of solar racking or every piece of electrical wiring here. What you're trying to figure out is, can I make enough, whether it's money or whether it's carbon savings or whether it's resilience improvements, am I going to get enough out of this to make it worthwhile investing the time, effort and money in doing that? There are some really good new pieces of technology that help you to get through that gate relatively quickly and relatively low cost to do that. You're trying to then find, the 2, 3, 4, 5 sites where this actually works, and you want to go and engage the market. I sort of talked earlier on about there being 4 stages. So once you've got that business case defined, the very next thing that you're going to want to do is go and collaborate with suppliers. They're going to be suppliers that are going to bring, for many businesses, first and foremost, money, because lots of people like to own these systems off their balance sheets through either leases or power purchase agreements, and then suppliers who are going to do EPC work for you, who are going to do construction work for you, suppliers of equipment and technology. All of that needs to be brought to bear around an opportunity that's got a really well-proven business case. That's the right path to follow, and you can get through that quickly. A matter of months, and you can be in a position where you're ready to sign contracts and get going on these kinds of projects.
Awesome, thanks, Calvin. The second part of that question, Liz, was legislative differences with respect to ACCU generations per state. Do they exist? How does that work?
Okay, so you just have to be aware of a couple of potential things. There is a hierarchy in terms of how many ACCUs you can earn from different things. So, for example, displacing diesel is always going to earn you the most ACCUs. And then the ranking actually goes in terms of who is the worst performing state. If you're connected to the grid and are looking to install behind the meter, Western Australia and Queensland are absolutely the highest intensity, have the highest emissions intensity of all of the states. Although Victoria, well, we'll see what happens, but you actually need to look through the Clean Energy Regulator's website to have a look and see which states rank where. But obviously Tasmania and to a large extent South Australia, if it's grid connected, you're actually not going to earn a huge amount of ACCUs because you're displacing what is essentially very little in the way of thermal energy or energy produced that has an emissions intensity attached to it. So there is a ranking and a hierarchy within the ACCUs. You do also need to be aware that if you're adding in any energy efficiency benefits as part of your business assessment, so as Calvin talked about through the business case, quite often there is a quite an interesting opportunity to reset some of your energy efficiency levels before you go and put in, install your behind the meter energy. If you're in New South Wales or Victoria, you have to be aware of the energy efficiency legislation in those states and potentially segregate what you're doing into a couple of different streams. All of it is doable, and in the initial stages, you just need to be aware that those things exist and that you need to take them into account, really.
Thanks, Liz. This next one is an interesting question. I think it's probably unfair of me to lob it at you, but I'm going to do it anyway, Liz, to see how you go. I don't know the answer to this. Are there any risks associated with playing in this space? Specifically, we have seen ASIC bring several cases for greenwashing against some listed entities. What's your view? That's really the end of the question.
Sure. So, look, in terms of the greenwashing legislation, absolutely, you're correct. And a lot of the greenwashing legislation relates to people making statements that they can't verify, is essentially what this is. You cannot ever get in trouble for greenwashing when talking about installing renewable energy behind your meter and displacing energy that you would otherwise have generated from diesel fuel or had taken from the grid. It is absolutely the best baseline to set to create credits. If you are talking about, as long as you're retiring the credits that you are making as part of your processes when you're talking about your carbon intensity of your business, you're undertaking the retirement and they're your credits, well, you can't get better than that. You wouldn't get done for greenwashing under those circumstances.
Thanks, Liz. Maybe just a couple of questions to wrap up. Calvin, the last one for you, unless there's anything pressing from the audience, is as someone who works in this space every day, what are the opportunities you see it in a general sense in on-site energy, and in particular for the Australian market in that regard?
So what would I say? So on-site energy doesn't work everywhere. When we look at this, it's somewhere in the order of about 40%, I would say, of the sites that we look at. On-site energy is a good fit. Where it's a good fit, it's better in basically all regards. Almost anybody who's contemplating energy purchase wants three things. They want it to be cheaper, they want it to be greener, and they want it to be more reliable. And in the right sites, in the right circumstances, on-site energy is actually able to be all three. It's cheaper, it's greener, and it's more reliable. It's just flat out better. So the opportunity is understand which of your sites fall into the 40% and which of your sites don't. And then where you find you've got a good business case, really the opportunity shifts to an execution challenge. How can you execute on all of those sites as much as possible in parallel? And for a lot of businesses, as much as possible without deploying too much of your own capital. That's where we see the real push. And I think on the flip side of that, the place where the industry, and that's both energy users and the supply market, get caught up and end up making all of our lives, a little bit more complicated than they need to be, spend a lot more cost of sale than anybody would really like to admit, is on chasing projects that are in the 60%, the ones that actually don't pencil. And it's a waste of energy users' time, it's a waste of suppliers' money, trying to build business cases in the wrong places. And still we see a heck of a lot of that. That's the biggest spot where between energy users, financiers, equipment suppliers, and EPCs, there's space to make the business better for all involved.
Thanks, Calvin. And Liz, the final question for you, which I'll weave a little bit of audience into, giving us a really good overview of the legislative landscape. In your own words, what do you see as the opportunity for C&I customers? And I know there's some miners, there's a lot of miners on the call as well. What's the opportunity here? It's a new space. There's going to be opportunities for first movers. How would you summarize it?
Well, I think we've covered the opportunity reasonably well. I think that risk management is critical here in terms of looking at not only your supply chain, but also your customer chain, and where you're undertaking exports to continents or countries that will potentially charge you a border tax. You really do need to think about self-insurance. And self-insurance comes in the form of ACCUs. So there is a value that you need to consider to things like creating ACCUs that is greater than just being green, okay? There is an insurance element to all of this that has to be considered, because you don't want to find yourself caught short in a couple of years' time.
Awesome. I think we're going to wrap there, folks. Calvin and Liz, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for your insight. It's certainly very appreciated from our perspective, and I can see by the list of questions from the audience. Also, to the audience, folks, you'll receive a recording of this webinar. I believe it's also available on LinkedIn Live. The emails of the presenters will be available. I'd encourage you to reach out to them directly if you do have any questions. Speaking on their behalf, I'm sure they'd be only too happy to help you. Their passion for the subject is very clear. And thanks for taking the time out of your day to attend this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Thanks, Liz. Absolute pleasure. Thanks to everybody who came along.